hope everyone has enjoyed our first two talks of the morning. Right now, we're going to have a panel discussion. We're going to learn about local efforts in landscape level conservation. We're going to hear from 6 panelists, and specifically we'll hear from 6 land trusts: the Maine Coast Heritage Trust, Down East Lakes Land Trust, the Down East Coastal Conservancy, Down East Salmon Federation, Frenchman Bay Conservancy, and Blue Hill Heritage Trust. I hope I didn't leave anybody out. We're going to work east to west, so we're going to start with our most eastern project, and that is the Maine Coast Heritage Trust, and this is Marty Anderson.
Thanks, Barbara. So I'm a project manager for,
I just want to remind everyone to hold your questions until the end. We're going to have a 10-minute question and answer discussion. Okay, so we're just going to run through these all together.
Thanks. So I'm a project manager in Eastern Washington County for Maine Coast Heritage Trust. And I want to talk about conservation partnerships in the Cobscook Bay of one place. And I'll explain a little bit more about what that means in just a second. But Cobscook Bay has been a conservation priority for a long time for a whole number of different partners. It's a focus area of ecological significance for the state's beginning with habitat program. It's a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service priority. It's a priority in the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, for example. Several local and regional land trusts see Cobscook and the general region around it as an important place for conservation. It's a stop, or it's a portion of the Gold Coast Scenic Byway runs through Cobscook Bay, ironically enough. The Down East Sunrise Trail runs through Cobscook Bay region, and the newly formed Down East Fisheries Trail. And it's also what Maine Coast Heritage Trust refers to as a whole place. And this idea of a whole place is a Maine Coast Heritage Trust term that really means a priority conservation site where significant scenic, ecological, and recreational values exist together, and where MCHT takes a proactive approach to conservation. So you're looking at Cobscook region here. The circle is not of special significance, just to focus in on the area. This is Eastport and Lubec here, the bookend communities at the mouth of the bay, Edmonds, Trescott, Perry, Pembroke, Lubec, South Lubec. And this area, this general area within the circle has over 50,000 acres of land area. And Cobscook Bay, as I said, is a Maine Coast Heritage Trust whole place. And this whole place concept is something that's about 20 years old for us. And it's really about, aside from what the quote says, places where there are multiple conservation values, especially ecological values and public access values together, where there's substantial stretches of natural coastal waterfront, areas that are traditionally important to local communities, and that's a really important thing to focus on as well. Where there are linkage to other conservation lands or possibilities to link to other conservation efforts, where there are good opportunities for funding and support, and where we feel there's a strong need for MCHT participation in order for that conservation to succeed. So let's take a quick look at some of the conservation values that we're talking about here. So, right off the top, Cobscook Bay is the highest density of nesting bald eagles in the entire northeastern United States. It's full of important water access points, both to places like productive shellfish beds that are important to the local economy, as well as for recreational access for boating or for hikes along the water, etc. Got some fantastic aquatic habitat both for native brook trout populations as well as for endangered Atlantic salmon, like that guy there. Important shorebird feeding and roosting areas, as well as nationally significant seabird nesting islands, large intact blocks of undeveloped and unbroken forest lands, wading bird and waterfowl habitat, unique scenic viewpoints. It goes on and on. Really, when you put it all together, we feel that Cobscook is really a focus area that has international significance as a conservation opportunity. So how can you be successful in an area this large? Again, it's over 50,000 acres. And how can you conserve at least some of those conservation attributes? And really, one way is by focusing effort not on every single place within the bay, because you really can't protect everything, and probably shouldn't try to anyway, but to focus on discrete areas within Copscook Bay where you can focus effort and build off the past conservation success. And of course, the theme of this talk is by working in partnership. And that's certainly what MCHT has done over the past 20 years in this area. Other partners have been working even longer. And we do that in two ways. I mean, MCHT does hold land and hold conservation easements within Copscook Bay, but as a statewide organization, we also feel it's an important role for us to play to help our local and regional partners in several ways. And that includes through technical support, negotiating and legal assistance, as well as acquiring temporarily holding lands. We can react faster sometimes than certain partner agencies can, and we'll hold those lands temporarily and then transfer them to our local and regional partners. We give help with fundraising or collaborative planning, and really just being there as part of this informal network of partners and sharing of ideas. And just keep that in mind as I go through the next set of slides very quickly. So here we have land and easements that are actually held by Maine Coast Heritage Trust. Big deal, right? It's 20 years. That doesn't look very good, but you start adding in what our partners have done. You've got Maine Farmland Trust, the Nature Conservancy, Down East Coastal Conservancy, the state of Maine, and finally U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm sure I'm missing some because this is only as good as the data I have available. And you really see, especially in areas like up in the middle here, pointing right at myself there, like around Reversing Falls, just how many different colors, how many different partners are working side by side. And I think that's another point I want to make, that every partner kind of brings a complementary but somewhat unique set of skills and even priorities to the region. And there's no harm in just working side by side. It's not a competition. And when you put it all together, you really see that it kind of starts to look like something. You really get some critical mass in terms of conservation together. And what this map shows or represents is within this area, there have been over 100 conservation projects that have been completed. And of those, look at our records, the best estimate I can give is that we've probably been directly involved as a partner in the ways that I described in about half of those. But when you look at the graph down in the lower left, our little slice of the pie, the dark green, is really less than 15% of all the land and easement holdings that are there in Copscook Bay. And so again, it underscores that we do conservation easements, we do hold lands, but we feel that we're an important organization, both doing that, but as a convener, as a support organization, and as a partner who can help in other ways. And I'll just wrap up by saying that there are a lot of partners who don't show up on the map, but who are every bit as important. It's just that they don't hold land and easements, but they're still conservation partners in every sense of the word. That includes, private landowners, town and tribal governments, other nonprofits, including some community nonprofits like the Copscook Community Learning Center or Copscook Bay Resource Center, foundations and public granting agencies, educational institutions, regional planning organizations, a lot of different players, and really all pulling in the same direction, and again, bringing a unique skill set to the region. And with that, I will yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Grand Lake Stream.
Thank you, Marty. I'm Mark Berry. I'm the Executive Director of the Down East Lakes Land Trust. And as you noted, we are based in Grand Lake Stream, which is an inland corner of this region that you saw on some of the earlier maps already, and you'll see on mine. But Down East Lakes Land Trust was founded by people in the local community with the idea of conservation as an economic strategy. The original mission of the trust was to contribute to the economic and environmental well-being of the region with conservation and exemplary management of forests and waters as the primary tools. That's a little bit unusual. It was very unusual at the time, and I think as the question earlier brought to the fore, focus on the economic significance of conservation is common now, but it arose not from a conservation group realizing it had economic significance, it could have or should have, but from a local community that was seeking solutions to challenges in front of it and saw conservation as an answer. We've boiled that mission down, these next few slides are quick, to forests and lakes for people forever. And that's the village of Grand Lake Stream with West Grand in the back. West Grand Lake is about a 14,000 acre lake. The total body of water is about 22,000 contiguous, and a lot more lakes up and downstream. There's a map of the region, and the village of Grand Lake Stream is near the center. That's the little village you just saw in that picture. That's the lake that was in the background. You were seeing sort of this area in that picture. The Land Trust, in its first months, sought to put together a proposal for conservation of what most people would consider a very large landscape, and ultimately prepared a short report calling for conservation of 370,000 acres. There were a lot of partners that were incredibly important in that, and I'll come back to that point. But this was a group in a very small community with no history of any of this type of effort and very little experience, and the vision became very large very quickly. The original thought coming out of the community was to go to the new investment owner of 450,000 acres of former Georgia Pacific land and asked to buy 40,000 acres as a community forest. The answer was, that's a nice idea, but you'll never do it, so go away. Come back if you have help or a smaller plan. And the process of seeking help led to a much bigger plan, which involved a somewhat smaller community forest and a much larger easement. What is now on this map is approximately 34,000 acres that's owned and managed by Down East Lakes Land Trust as the Farm Cove Community Forest, a 312,000 acre easement held by the New England Forestry Foundation, with an overlaying public access easement held by the state of Maine, a corridor along the St. Croix River that Woody Wheaton Land Trust had started that effort with the New England Forestry Foundation before Down East Lakes Land Trust got started, and a 22,000 acre effort that is our current project. Our goal is to acquire that property as community forest. It is now under a conservation easement. Those are the properties that comprise that 370,000 acres, and they are all in permanent conservation as of now, 10 years after that report came out. There are other important properties in this mix, including Passamaquoddy Tribe and Indian Township and their forest land to our northwest, a Duck Lake unit of state and Machias River Corridor state land, Nicotaus easement here, and as Jim mentioned earlier, a very large area of crown lands and protected areas in New Brunswick, of which that's just a very small corner. The entire contiguous area here is close to 1.4 million acres, 2/3 of that in Canada. So that's the large landscape, that's where it came from, but even at the scale of what Down East Lakes Land Trust owns and manages, we consider that a significant landscape. Again, almost 34,000 acres, 71 miles of lakeshore. Stewardship is as important to the vision of the land trust as conservation was, and it's a long-term challenge and a long-term opportunity for local people to have a voice in how their forests are managed and how they contribute to and support the economy. In general, the priorities for managing a community forest are wildlife habitat, public recreation, and a sustainable timber economy. So we are actively managing the majority of that property for timber and for wildlife habitat. We've done a lot of work to restore aquatic habitat connectivity. Some of those projects are on the map. You see little arches. water droplets where road crossings have been removed, bridges where bridges have been installed. We've developed hiking trails to add to the mix of recreational opportunities along with water access, campsites on the lakes. The biggest recreational driver of the economy in Grand Lake Stream is fishing, and will probably and hopefully remain fishing. And most of those people may never set foot on this property, but they see it when they're on the lakes, when they're out with a guide. They benefit from it when they're fishing Grand Lake Stream because of the protection of the watershed upstream. And the economy in the village of Grand Lake Stream is almost entirely based on the recreation economy. About a dozen different sporting camps and lodges, there are a lot of working guides. The economy of interior Washington County more broadly is tilted more strongly to the timber industry. And the mill in Baileyville is the county's largest employer. Our timber goes there if it's hardwood for pulp, but it goes throughout the region depending what the product is. And we see the activity of harvesting a log and delivering it to a mill as accomplishment of our mission in support of employment in Washington County. And the majority of the value that comes from each log is going to the people that are out in the woods cutting that log and the people that are hauling it to the mill. So I mentioned I was going to come back to partners. I did already mention New England Forestry Foundation in holding that easement in the Woody Wheaton Land Trust. They were the partners in the original conservation project, which was the Down East Lakes Forestry Partnership. That was a collaborative capital campaign that led to the first acquisition. The mosaic of partners that Down East Lakes Land Trust works with has shifted with each project, with each effort from conservation acquisitions to our stewardship efforts on the ground. And the range of types of partners is huge, from our neighboring conservation organizations to national, international conservation organizations, the various types of entities here. I'd say they're all essential. As somebody mentioned, we're a very small staff. We just added an education and communications position, which we're excited about, but that brought us to 3 people in the office. So we clearly have benefited from our relationships with a lot of partners, and that's how a lot of this has gotten done and how we hope it will continue to get done. With that, we'll move further west.
Hi, if you're looking at your programs, you'll notice that I'm not Tom Loria. Tom was ill this morning and couldn't come, so I'm Sherry Sprangers. I'm on the board of the Down East Coastal Conservancy. Have been since its inception in 2009. So the Down East Coastal Conservancy, we formed by a merger of the Great Auk Land Trust and the Quaddy Regional Land Trust. And we, in our very first year, we went to work on a strategic plan for the organization. And we identified we identified several things, but 2 specific things that were part of that strategic plan. We felt that we wanted to do a project that would closely involve and benefit the communities within our region, and we wanted to do a large project. We wanted to do a landscape scale project. We said part of the reason why we merged was so that we could do bigger things than either organization could do by itself. And lo and behold, we had one of those projects fall in front of us right in our hometown of Machias. And this is we dubbed it the 2 Rivers Project. It involved a piece of land, I'll show you a picture in a moment, a piece of land on the Middle River, right in the town of Machias, and another larger parcel along the Machias River between Machias and Whitneyville. And big project, over 1,000 acres total. We said, how are we going to do this? We want to do it, how are we going to do it? And one of the first things that we did was to establish a community partnership, a community committee. And that community included a number of individuals from town governments. It included individuals who had interests in businesses in the town. It included board members. It included educational representatives. And we went to work on this project, and what we wanted to do was to be able to, in order to do the fundraising for it, what we really, really focused on were going to be the benefits to the local community. So you look at what we've got here, and so here's the basic town of Machias. The university is here, the high school and the elementary school is right here, and the hospital here. The two pieces of property, here's what we call the Middle River parcel. There's the Middle River, comes down the causeway into the Machias River, and then this larger piece here along the Machias River, from basically from Whitneyville all the way to into the town line of Machias. And linking these two parcels is the Sunrise Recreational Trail. And we looked at that and we said, what a cool opportunity to be able to have the schools and the hospitals right there. They have land that backs right up to the Sunrise Trail to give them quick access to both of these large pieces of property. Remember what all my slides are here, sorry. So looking at what we did was to, we did the fundraising both on a local level through a sponsor an acre program. People could buy a sponsor an acre for $100, and we did a bunch of fundraising through foundations. And what was really exciting to a lot of the organizations that supported us was that close link with the community and what the community benefits were going to be for health and recreation. So what you're seeing here is, in some parts of this are completed. This is a plan for the recreational access on these properties. There are a number of trails have already been established. Coming along here, there's a historic trail along the Machias River that was from the logging days. And so we said, this is what we want to do. We want to be able to get kids from the schools. They can quickly go to one direction or another, from the hospital, the healthy aspects of it. Excuse me. And so we completed this project. It took us just under, it was a $1.9 million project. It took us like 2 years to be able to do that. We included over a $500,000 endowment for the stewardship of these lands. We just had our annual board retreat a couple weeks ago, and one of the items on that agenda was keeping our promises. What are we going to do now? We finished the fundraising campaign. Now what are we going to do? So the Middle River parcel is primarily, it has some conservation value. This is all wetland all along here. There's some woods on there. So there's waterfowl habitat in this area here. There's recreational opportunities for people to put in small boats onto the Middle River and paddle up and paddle back down, nice and easy. But it's primarily, we're looking at that as recreation for the town area. The larger piece here along the Machias has some different conservation values. For one thing, it continues the conservation along the Machias River from the Machias River corridor. You saw Mark showed you part of the upper part of that. That corridor comes down right about it'd be about here on the map probably. But what we want to do with this parcel is to develop a community forest. And a community forest can mean a number of different things. We're hoping for it to have some real educational values to it. We're not looking to support our organization by logging this piece of property. What we really want to be able to do is to demonstrate different methods of forestry. We want to have education activities for the community and for foresters on this particular property. There is, to go back to this idea of partnerships, this was a huge, required a number of partnerships for this. The Maine Coast Heritage Trust was instrumental in helping us to be able to jockey through all of the various bills of sale and things like that. And we have a number of ongoing partnerships with the hospital, with the schools, both the public schools and the university, and with that larger community group as well. And we'll be moving forward, as we say, trying to develop the forest management plan and think about how that's going to work. That's involving local foresters, and you know, it's a major partnership, sort of an opportunity for us.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dwayne Shaw with the Down East Salmon Federation. Actually, Sherry might have been able to pick right up and talk about this as well, since her husband is the president of our board, Don Springs. And Tom and I could have been sick together or gone fishing today. But, I think that's where Tom lives. So our organization is a little bit different, and it came to land conservation through a different route, and it kind of predated some of the land conservation that has happened down east. So in 1982, anglers got together to form this federation among angling clubs, salmon clubs, really, that existed down east for decades and decades, on the Narraguagas, Pleasant, all the way to the Denny's River. And when the salmon got listed as endangered, the question was, so, you know, what are we going to do? We're going to protect habitat for salmon, and who's going to do it? And no one raised their hand, so we stepped forward. So we were running a hatchery. We now run 2 hatcheries. We became involved with outreach and education in a much bigger way. Once the fish got listed, our organization went through kind of a transformation, and it was sort of someone talked about the Confederates. It was earlier, there was a breach there at a period of time when the salmon got listed. What are we going to do? Are we going to fight? Are we going to become, partners? And I think we chose the group that stuck together, became partners in this restoration effort, which is now branched out into diatomeous fish in general. Is really the theme of what we're doing currently. You see the mission, it's broad, but we work on salmon in most generally, and that is kind of the fish that connects us all, I would say, whereas the alewife, people would say, is the fish that feeds all. So there are fish, and they sort of iconically in different ways. And I'm not going to talk about either of those, so I'm going to talk about another fish here in a moment, and about a project, very, very small land conservation project that is focused on another anadromous fish. But you see the name of our land trust, Down East Rivers Land Trust. If we had known that there was a group forming at the same time called the Down East Lakes Land Trust, I don't know if we would have chosen that name. And it's, but that was the same point in time that Grand Lake Stream was in this process of developing the Down East Lakes Land Trust. So, as our name points out, we're focused on the rivers of Washington, primarily Washington County. But what's some people have suggested we should have called ourselves the Down East Rivers or Waterfall Land Trust, because we've ended up with a bunch of waterfalls or former hydroelectric locations or hydro locations that were mill sites and so on, which is an important piece of the story about our group and how we do our work, because we look at the world often through the lens of goggles and snorkel. So if your perspective in terms of conservation can be quite radically different if you're in a boat or you're under the water, and if you're a fish, landscape is a different thing. As we talk about landscape connectivity and landscape scale conservation, We may need to be thinking also, our orientation is such that often we're talking about aquascapes and connection of aquascapes across the landscape. So that's a little bit about what the approach that we take to our work. It's very much rooted in the community. Its origins are from angling and sporting interests, and has grown from that point. So the little tiny project I'm going to talk about is this one here, and I chose this one. We have other projects which are riparian corridors along the Pleasant River, or pieces of riparian corridor on the Machias River, or community forests with active landscape management for sustainable forestry and other things. But this one's kind of unique, and I think that can be kind of illustrative of some of the things that we may want to take into consideration. I've got 5 minutes. So Redmond's Creek, if any of you have ever had the pleasure of going smelting in the middle of the night with a bunch of people who you can't see, and they're saying, can't understand what they're doing,
And they're half drunk.
and they're half drunk, and the wardens are in the bushes, this is probably the place you work. So Redmond's is, it was a well-known spot on the landscape in the town of Harrington. If you see the beaten down path along the side of the stream, we didn't have to create trails. They were already there. And we did pick up some tires and other things that were there, but we preserved this little piece of the landscape because we knew it was important. This is a smelt spawning habitat. This is one of the most important smelt spawning locations in the greater Pleasant Bay area, based on observations that we've been making. And we knew through our network, local network, that suddenly it came up for sale. So we tried to jump out and do something about it. It's 8 acres total here. But it encompassed both sides of the stream and the old gravel pit, and the access road, and the trails, and you see the smelts can only get it to this ledge here, and they spawn there. And we reached out to some of the bigger organizations in the region, and some of our partners in Maine Coast Heritage Trust stepped up with a nice portion of the purchase price, and Down East Coastal Conservancy and Pleasant River Wildlife Foundation. But we also work closely with the town, so the selectmen lived nearby, 2 selectmen lived and grew up fishing on the stream. They could walk to this from their homes. And then as the project went forward, we realized, well, we should dedicate this, and we dedicated it in memory of Charlie Parker, who was the high school, Maryland High School teacher, who died young, leukemia, and had been a close partner of ours. So it really brought the community together around a tiny little piece of the landscape, and it was featured in the town's annual report that this was an achievement that they had participated in. Well, they hadn't raised any money, contributed any money to it, but they rallied behind it and cheerleaded for us, and they brought donuts and things to the celebration, and we finally pulled it together, which was really great. So how many of these are there on the landscape? And that was the next question. So what we did was a little survey of hundreds of streams across this landscape. These are first order streams, so these are not, when you think of streams, it's a big tree, you think of the Machias River with all those tiny little tributaries. Well, these are like those tiny little tributaries. And as aquatic ecologists, you all know that those tiny little tributaries are a place where the bulk of productivity actually is achieved ecologically. Well, they're also closely associated with estuaries, which we also know are highly productive spots on the globe. So when you put a first order stream next to an estuary, what do you get? You get monstrous productivity. And smelts out of Redmond's are counted in barrels, and the spawn on the gravel is 2 inches thick at a time. Black stocks are in there spot on the landscape. So when you look at that, and it's Cobscook up there, and you come down from Steuben to Calais, we went stream by stream. We had all kinds of partners involved with this and volunteers. Maine Outdoor Heritage Fund supported the mileage and some of the costs involved. UMM helped us with some of the GIS. But what we started to do is to rank all these streams and get a sense of the community. But in order to get access, we had to talk to a lot of local people. We wanted local knowledge of what do these streams mean to you and what do they mean in terms of their productivity. So we've begun to rank them and look at threats to them and so on. And hopefully there'll be many more little Friends Creek projects in the future. The next step of this is to take, and we had a student at UMM who's in Tora's program there at GIS, to model this. So can you model where you can predict smelt habitat would be, and therefore not spend so much time out on the landscape walking out into the middle of the whole coast to look at Bar Brook or something. But you could model it and say, okay, now in Hancock County or the rest of the coast, we know predict where those streams are. So that's kind of the next step. And we've actually got a student that's been doing a good job on that with us. So that's one little story of a successful project that can be replicated. The threats on the landscape, and I'm over my zero, I'm going to take some more this time. Are these features. So of course, Route 1 is your kind of your dividing line between where people live and the ownership patterns are quite different. There's a lot of imprint, footprint there, and over the years and continuing today, the culverts, the dams, and so on and so forth play out in real important ways in terms of what our fisheries are doing. So if you look at Cobscook, you get up to the Orange River, you swim, you get right at the head of tide, and what do you see? It's the old joke, what does the salmon say, but it runs into a brick wall, dam. You get there. And you go over to the place called Smelt Stream. There's two Smelt Streams on this map. It's actually three on the total map, identified as Smelt Brook. One is in the Middle River, right near the project that we heard about. And there's a dam in the Middle River. There aren't been smelts there 100+ years. You go down here to Hancock County, there's another one just down the road here called Smelt Brook. And that one hasn't had smelt. It has these smelt cove, and it hasn't had smelt for probably 100 years. So these are the kinds of things that we can address once we have an inventory. Thank you.
I'm Tom Sidar. I'm the Executive Director of Frenchman Conservancy. Passed a few smelt slides. Make me hungry, I like smelts. Frenchman Conservancy, our focus area, once called Schoodic to Schoodic, but we've slightly changed the definition of it. Schoodic Point to the Donnell Pond Reserve, Maine public land, and that's basically from Acadia National Park right out the door here. I don't have to ask for a show of hands how many have been to Schoodic Point or understand how beautiful it is. And the focus area runs north to basically Tunk Mountain, and that's about 22 miles according to the Google Earth ruler that I put down last night. It's also fairly wide, and that's a challenge to a land trust as to what to include in a focus area. It's about 8 miles wide if we want to include our preserves like Korea Heath and Long Pond. So it's a large area. It is a landscape project, and it's important for 3 reasons. And I like to think that you can do a lot of strategic planning, but if you park your car in the morning and you know what you're focused on, that's truly a strategic plan. and Frenchman Bay Conservancy is focused on watershed quality, wildlife habitat, and public recreational access. Well, as a landscape area, it's very significant. It runs from the bold rocky coastline right out the door through the preserves of FBC and Maine Coast Heritage Trust and other land trusts to the crystal clear mountains and lakes to the north. As one woman found this on the web, as a woman from Tallahassee, Florida said, Schoodic Point is a must-see part of Acadia National Park. The power of the surf and amazing rocks are unlike anything you will see elsewhere. Kids love climbing on those rocks for hours. Well, in my experience, and I'm sure you'll agree if you've ever climbed up Schoodic Mountain on a hot summer day and ended with a swim in Schoodic Beach on Donnell Pond, that the Donnell Pond Maine Reserve land, with its remote forests, crystal clear lakes, secluded ponds, and mountains with panoramic views are also a must-see. For the east coast of the United States, these relatively wild lands, these relatively unfragmented wildlife corridors, and these clean watersheds are rare and getting increasingly more rare. So it's really no wonder that there are so many strong collaborating conservation agencies and organizations working to protect this area. Just to name a few, the National Park Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the State of Maine Department of Conservation, Maine Coast Heritage Trust, and Frenchman Bay Conservancy. Starting here and moving north, a few conserved land highlights. There are 2,376 acres in Acadia National Park at the Schoodic Peninsula. The recent enormous accomplishment of many partners, can't name them all, but the Schoodic Woods LLC project adds another 3,000 acres to the north of Schoodic Point. And you can see that's the orange down to the south there, with a conservation easement that Maine Coast Heritage Trust has with Winter Harbor Water District right in the dead center of it. That's 3,000 acres. The sort of ghosted blue area moving up towards the green area to the north, Donnell Pond Reserve, that's really the focus area, and that's the challenge of this very large landscape level conservation project. And you can see within that that there are FBC preserves, which are highlighted in sort of the rust color, and then FBC easements, and also U.S. Fish and Wildlife Reserves in the light blue. So we're sort of we're putting together basically a patchwork quilt to try to achieve this large landscape level project. I said earlier that all landscape or all conservation is local, and that's certainly true, and I wanted to just kind of zero in on a Frenchman Bay Conservancy project. Basically, this is a connector. And what we really try to do when we evaluate our conservation programs is get adjacent to either our conserved lands or the National Parks conserved lands, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Maine Coast Heritage Trusts, and others to create significant corridors for, again, to protect the watershed, to protect wildlife habitat, and to provide recreational access. And if you look at that red line that starts down there in Sullivan at Long Cove, and it moves through Tucker Mountain, which is an easement that Frenchman Bay Conservancy holds, through to the west of Long Pond, and then on up towards basically starting to approach Schoodic Bog. So that those projects along there, most recent one being to the east of Catamount Mountain. I think about 4 years ago, when we were talking about landscape level and connection with the communities and how important that was, a friend of mine who I believe is in the audience today, Jay Espy, said, we were driving by Dunbar's store, and he said, when you connect with Phil Dunbar, you will know you've gone local, you've truly gone local. So we purchased that northern part there. We purchased 65 acres from Phil Dunbar and Sullivan, and I hiked through the woods with him probably about 4 or 5 different times, summer, winter, and fall, and we worked that deal. You can see that there is a gap in the middle, and that is our last project. They're all complicated. This is basically a 200-acre parcel. We really only need, probably just to make the connection, 50 or 100 acres. But they're all complicated, they're all local, and our projects are here in the east are not a huge amount of land parcels that are, it's very largely fragmented. So I think the next few areas, which I'll go through quickly, kind of show you the landscape. This is an aerial of Schoodic Point. This is our Long Pond Preserve running north towards Schoodic Mountain at the top. And the trail that we're envisioning would run along the west shore of Long Pond. And then this is a little bit to the east, but if you see in the foreground, that is Little Tunk Pond. I think that's familiar to many in the audience, particularly our keynote speaker, Jim Levitt. Our first preserve was public access to Little Tunk Pond, beautiful beach, short walk in. People use it all summer long. And working with Jim Levitt, we have protected most of the west of Little Tunk Pond. And the state owns most of what's to the west, the mountains and so forth. So we're looking at Tunk Lake, and there's one last project that Frenchman Conservancy has up there. We're working on pretty close to getting there on 576 acres on the east side of Tunk Lake that will protect all of the upland. So once again, we're basically working with a focus for 3 things, and the first is the protection of the watershed. The quality of this water is outstanding. The protection of the wildlife habitat corridor, which runs, as you can see, pretty much from the North Maine woods of Maine to the down east coast. And lastly, for public access and low impact recreation on the property. And it's been said many times, but if you don't have the support of the public, there is no law that will prevail if the will of the people is not behind you. So we want to get people out on the land, enjoying the land, appreciating nature, and supporting our efforts. Thank you.
Good morning, my name is Jim Dow. I'm the Executive Director of the Blue Hill Heritage Trust, and we've now reached the far reaches of the down east area, I guess. We're in the western edge, although when I was growing up in Belfast, when it was the broiler capital of the world, we considered Belfast and Rockland part of down east Maine, but it seems to have migrated. In any case, the Blue Hill Heritage Trust is a community-based land trust that's existed since 1985. As Jim Levitt spoke about the inflection point when the land trust started to take off, we were one of those. Began as a totally volunteer land trust. Got a professional staff in 2001, and since then we've protected about 6,500 acres, about 120 projects. a lot going on. We had done in-house conservation planning most of that time when we started doing it at all. Of course, like most land trusts, we began as sort of opportunistic. Whatever was there, we would try to do. That changed a little as time went on, and in 2008, we decided it was time to get an outside professional person to look at our landscape and do some planning for us. And we hired what we think is the best person in the state, Janet McMahon, to do a conservation plan for us, and she took about 18 months. Walked the landscape, got bitten by dogs, and got stuck in the woods, and I had a great time doing it, and came up with a book that identified about 10 focus areas that she thought that if we protected, we would make a big step forward in protecting the character and beauty of the place, protect wildlife habitat blocks and some corridors, and also protecting land and water that had economic use and recreational use by people. Now, these focus areas represent about 14% of our service area, which is about 150,000 acres. It's about 22,000 acres. They range in size from 300 acres to about 3,500 acres. They represent a variety of types of land. The selection criteria was reasonably simple. They had to have one or more intact landscapes, such as a small pond watershed, for example, or a stream, and they had to have a concentration of conservation values. So she came up with these, and there we were, and we decided, okay, now, and as Janet posed to us, she said, now your challenge is to decide what you're going to do with this. Are you going to try to do them all or not? And we did a strategic plan and thought that we would pick three that we would focus on initially up in this area in particular, and this area. Interestingly, and it was very interesting to our board, after she got done and presented to us, she said, what you need to do is look at the ocean and then turn around, because the ocean landscape in this area is basically fragmented and largely developed, and the conservation opportunities are inland. And they aren't going to persist forever, and now is your opportunity to do something. So there's only like one of these focus areas that has significant saltwater areas associated with it, but most of them, 9 out of the 10, have water as a primary element, which is interesting. So we actually had a capital campaign right in the middle of the economic downturn, which was a really difficult thing, and got some of the work begun, and of course, as you can see, these are some of our protected lands within these focus areas. So we already had, in most of them, had some land that served as anchor parcels, if you will. But part of the implementation after that capital campaign was an idea that we would try something a little bigger, and it involved a focus area that was not identified, and it was the Vagadoos River, which was intentionally left out of our focus area study because it was too big, and it was marine, and it was estuary. It's been important to us in this area for a long time. We've been working on it in small pieces. Ed has had other partners, but we formed a partnership with Maine Coast Heritage Trust and a neighboring land trust, the Conservation Trust of Castine, and developed a project and submitted it to the North American Wetlands Conservation Act program. And to our great surprise, really, because normally they're not funded the first time around, we got funded for $1 million to buy some land. The partnership, it was really good partnership because Maine Coast provided a lot of the institutional help to manage this bureaucratic exercise that it is both to put in the proposal and to manage the reporting. But all of the the project area is within our service area. So we get the fun of doing the projects, and the next couple of weeks, a couple more are going to close, and we're spending down that money as fast as we can, and with the opportunity to do more. Once you're in that pipeline, the odds of getting more to do more is good. This is a really wonderful watershed, little known, but according to some state biologists, it's the third most important estuarine in the state, behind Cobscook and Merrimeeting Bay. It's a lovely place full of wildlife, and the other thing I'd say about this whole service area, in particular this area, that unlike most of the other speakers in other service areas, there's very little state involvement in the land conservation world. I mean, our service area, there's part of Long Island, which the National Park Service bought an easement on, which is about 4,000 acres. And there's a neglected state park called Holbrook Island that the state took reluctantly many years ago and sort of treats as an orphan, I guess one might say. It's a 1,200 acres, a lovely, lovely place, but most of the conservation, it has to be private in this area. It's just, there's very little public land, and for whatever historical reasons that may be. So there we are, we're crunching away at this project, and this, one last slide, how this looks in relation to our focus areas. One of the attractions for doing this was that it includes most of 4 of our focus areas and allows us to have money to do the work within those focus areas. The other thing I'll mention finally, and my time is up, is that the same conservation planner who did our work, Janet McMahon, has just completed one for the Great Pond Mountain Conservation Trust, which serves the neighboring area, and there is some overlap. And so as we all of a sudden think bigger and bigger scale and how to relate, this will be really helpful to us. And we're excited. I look forward to reading that conservation plan. Thank you.
Panelists come up, and we will have questions. You can pull your chairs out a little bit. And we're going to share this microphone. And Seth, if you want to do question and answer. Okay. Do we have any questions, immediate questions? Hello, can you hear me?
I have a question. I'm not sure who it's for exactly, because all of you have come to certain challenges in terms of scaling up that I think is impressive and laudable. But I'm wondering if you sought outside help to help get your board, your membership, to make that leap of faith with you to go from small individual projects and special places to really, all of these are very large and connected landscapes, and probably reaching into areas that you might not have had any former experience in.
Go ahead. Just try it. You didn't turn it off.
So
Hello?
Anyway, since I'm holding the mic, I'll start. With the Down East Coastal Conservancy, when we did our initial strategic plan, we did have outside help for that. We had a consultant come in and help us with that, and so that sort of set the stage for when the project came up and became available. The board had already said, "Yeah, we said we were going to do that. Let's go."
In our case, it was a very sort of gradual progression. Personally, I had been involved in the landscape scale conservation with the Nature Conservancy in Cobscook years ago, and they were just experimenting with the whole notion. And so I guess I brought that. But I would say it's a real challenge for these little organizations. The capacity issue is just pressing. You know, how do we do this work? How do we have enough human capacity really to continue the work? Not to mention the acquisition phase, but the stewardship phase, which is enormous, of course. And so we are, for example, right in the middle of a merger with a the neighboring land trust, the Conservation Trust of Castine, they were an all-volunteer organization which has decided they had run their course. They had gone as far as they could. And I suspect over the next period of 10 years, my feeling is there'll probably be a lot more consolidation of organizations, just because the costs of running these little organizations are growing, and to a point where it probably doesn't make sense to have so many dispersed organizations paying for these administrative structures. So it's a long answer.
I think for Frenchman Conservancy, there are a lot of people to thank. Our strategic plan was worked by our board, and a lot of committed board members, and a lot of volunteer hours, and a lot of very thoughtful comments. We also got support from Maine Coast Heritage Trust and the Maine Land Trust Network, Land Trust Alliance. The accreditation process moved us along a little more quickly perhaps than we would have. So mostly the work was done in-house. We didn't pay any outside consultants, but we got a lot of help from collaborative organizations and a lot of volunteer help from within our board.
In our case, we have a very focused mission in terms of where our land trust work is conducted, and that's riparian buffers. So it's been an easier job for us. We didn't have to weigh between mountaintops and clam flat acquisition, which is typical of some of the coastal land trusts. I can see the difficulties there, but in the regional context, I think there was this Maine Coast Protection Initiative a couple of years back, which I think did lead to the merger of Great Auk and Quaddy into DCC. We were part of that from the offset, and I think that taking some of these planning initiatives and efforts and really putting them together on the landscape is sometimes not so easy in its capacity. It really is, boils down to capacity, but I think being responsive to local needs does beg the question of how many organizations should there be, and just being attentive to that, to be able to be nimble and address those things at the local level.
Let's just try to make the responses quick so we can hear lots of questions.
I'll pass on that one in interest of another question.
Michael?
Well, in light of what you're talking about, I'm just wondering, the fact that we don't have a marine fisheries anymore, you can't go down to your pier and buy a fish. Why isn't the government, our state government, getting more involved with trying to help you guys out and being more involved with bringing back our fisheries? And I know that Dwayne is itching to say something, but I think, from my perspective, we don't have a fishing industry. There's a huge amount of economic development that we're missing because we have dams on small rivers. We've got some really common sense things that we can do really quickly, and we've got the capacity right here to make that happen fast, but we've got to push the capacity or get the state to jump on board because we're all losing money here. So it's an interesting problem.
Just, I think the state is asking the same question. Where's the public? They really are begging for partnerships around this, the state and federal government. So, the great example of that is the relicensing of the Union River dams right now, right at head of tide, dam with no fishway. And then you can look at the next stream to the west, and there's an abandoned dam from the 70s with no fishway. And it's something that society has not placed a priority on. It's really, it's a movement that's come and gone in terms of fish restoration work. And you can look back to the 1600s and you can see those patterns over time. And I think that now we've got to step up and do that, and and understand that we live on a post-industrial landscape. So when Lubeck matured and became a sardine production factory, the Orange River was dammed, and there was hydroelectric generation there. Well, when that was abandoned, who stepped up to the plate to address the fish passage needs around that? And the same could be, there's a story for every stream, and the log driving era and the farming era all left its imprints on the fish and the streams and the ocean. So I think that an inventory of these things needs to be done in this region, and then we need a coalition to address that. And it is real estate. I mean, that's one thing I want to emphasize, that dams are real estate, and when land trusts are looking at prioritizing, we can look at it that way.
We have no more time. But I do want to add one thing to that comment. As most of you know, I work a lot with diadromous species. This is a known fact, or little known fact, sorry about that. The state does not put any funding into Atlantic salmon. So even though we have the Department of Marine Resources and we have staff that are charged with restoring salmon, okay? And there's plenty of them. There's probably, 5 or 10 of them, staff members. None of their funding comes from the state. They are all federally funded. So what this gets back to is citizens have to let their representatives and the governor know, okay, that you support fisheries. And that's what it comes down to. So, okay, thank you, everyone. And remember that if you have any questions, ask them at lunch as well, because we have a nice long lunch period. So now we're going to go to Andy Cutco. And Andy is with the Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry.
Thank you, Barbara. I feel like I should be selling cattle at an auction with this thing on. So talk to me later if you want to buy a cow. Thank you, Barbara, and thanks for the opportunity to join a very thoughtful group of folks here in what I consider to be one of my favorite parts of the state. As a state ecologist for the last 15 years or so, I've had the real perk of being able to get to travel to some of the most remote and interesting parts of Maine, and down East Maine is certainly a special place. You've heard that earlier today, and I'll certainly reiterate that from my personal experience, not only within Maine, but across the east coast of North America as well. So what I'm going to talk about today is I'll start with this very simple and straightforward question of how much is enough conserved land? I think that probably most of us who have worked in the conservation field have been asked this question at some point, or have asked this question of others at some point. So it's an interesting one that I have worked with our Ecological Reserves Scientific Advisory Committee on over the last few years. I facilitate this committee in Maine that oversees the research and education and management of 100,000 acres of ecological reserves. And so we have worked on this question. I'll share some of our thoughts on that. We heard 70% earlier. I think that's a pretty bold and ambitious number. We'll look at what the conserved land status is in Maine and down East Maine and talk about, again, our approach to this question. I should probably just interject here that I'm going to be talking about conserved land primarily from a science perspective. I feel like I'm sort of the token scientist here. Josh Reut will continue that trend after lunch. I recognize, obviously, that there are recreational, social, economic, political constraints and drivers of conservation land, but as my position as an ecologist, I'm really looking at this primarily from a science and ecology or biodiversity standpoint. So I'll talk about what's in the conservation portfolio for down East Maine, what have we conserved, and just as important, what are we missing? What kinds of habitats or what things are we missing from our conserved land? And then I think I'll have enough time for some discussion points and take-home messages at the end. I've just got 15 or 16 slides, so Barbara's going to keep me on track, and we'll try to make sure we've got some time for that at the end. Okay, so just to provide some context for this question of how much is enough conserved land, let's look at overall in the state of Maine right now. We've got roughly 20% of the state is in some form of conserved land. We've made dramatic increases over the last decade in those numbers. Millions of acres, primarily in the form of conservation easements. We've heard about the great work that Mark's done. A lot of that work has happened in northwest Maine as well. So millions of acres of conservation easement have come into the conservation arena. When we look a little closer at down east Maine, you can see those numbers, 17%, both in the down east section and then what's called the eastern interior section. So we're doing quite well here in this region. I should just explain the map for a minute and explain that those are what are called ecological sections or ecological regions. Some people call them biophysical regions. Politicians and others will look at the state from county or town boundaries. We look at the state as ecologists with regard to biophysical boundaries. These are areas with similar climate, geology, and vegetation. So we've divided the state up into 7 of these regions and then done an assessment of how much conserved land is in each of the regions. But I think one thing that we all recognize is that there are multiple types of conservation land. Obviously, there are many owners and agencies behind conserving land. So roughly 20% of the state is in some type of conserved land status. We have a much finer subset of land that we call reserve. These are lands that are essentially off limits to timber harvesting. So places like Acadia National Park, the Donnell Pond Ecological Reserve that we've heard about a few times today, the Down East Lakes Land Trust has a small ecological reserve. State parks, Acadia National Park, these are areas, a much finer subset of the land that's truly conserved in the sense that it's off limits to timber harvesting. Most of these lands are open to lots of recreational uses, hunting and fishing, etc., but timber harvesting is not allowed. And when you look at that map for Maine, you see that there are a fair amount of differences between the eastern coast and the eastern interior. 9% of this coastal region is in that reserved land status. That's among the highest in the state because of places like Acadia National Park or the Moosehorn National Wildlife Refuge has a wilderness area. When you go across that border into the eastern interior, I'm not sure if I have just above there where you see the 1%. So most of the land that is conserved in that region is working forest easement where timber harvesting will continue to provide sustainable forestry for jobs and the economy, etc. But there's a very small subset of that land that is permanently reserved. And again, primarily it's around Fort Machias Lake, the Duck Lake Unit Ecological Reserve, and I believe the Sunk Cays has a little bit in that section as well. So we look at this information in terms of our Ecological Reserve Advisory Committee, and we said, well, those are the absolute numbers. Those are, I think, somewhat meaningful in terms of how we're doing for conserving land across the state. But as ecologists, we want to know what we're protecting. Are we truly protecting the variety and distribution of habitats that really characterize down east Maine? Iconic types like salt marshes or coastal peat bogs or lowland coastal spruce fir forests. Have we really captured that natural variety that occurs across down east? Or to paraphrase Aldo Leopold from 70 years ago, have we saved all the parts? And as ecologists, those things, those questions, are we saving all of those pieces? That's just as important to us as the overall numbers are. So, what are our ecological priorities? And we've heard about a number of these things already today, and just to reinforce them, landscape scale working forests that provide size and connectivity. Obviously size that provides for wide-ranging mammals, moose, black bear, lynx, etc. We've heard a lot about connectivity already today between certain conservation areas and providing corridors for wildlife movement. What ecologists call umbrella habitats, like deer wintering areas and intact riparian or aquatic systems. Yes, we're conserving streams for Atlantic salmon and brook trout, but there are a whole host of aquatic invertebrates and other species that are associated with riparian systems that are targets and values for conservation as well. Just like deer wintering areas, yes, we're conserving closed canopy coniferous forests for deer, but there are a wide variety of other mammals, pine marten, birds, black-throated green warbler that also occur in those deer wintering areas. So that's a good target. Rare natural communities like the jack pine forest that we all drove through on the way to get down here is an uncommon forest type in Maine. And rare species, whether it's a puffin or a orchid that grows in a bog, those are sort of more traditional targets for conservation. And I think Josh Royd after lunch will talk a little bit about the Beginning with Habitat program that was referenced earlier today as a place where conservation groups can get that information. What I want to spend a little bit more time talking about are those habitat types that are poorly represented on conserved land. So what are we missing? And how do we figure that out? And how could that method and how could that information be useful to you? And certainly as a forester, that's my training and my background is forestry. I do a lot of work with public forest managers and private forest managers. I want to say a thing or two about the importance of old forests on our landscape. So this concept of representation analysis, so how do we address this question of are we saving all the parts? Well, we've got three different criteria. The first one is, does our conserved land generally look like our overall landscape? So let's take down East Maine, for example. If you look at forest type maps of down East Maine, roughly 50–55% is spruce fir forest. Do the conserved lands in the region have 50–55% spruce fir forest? Or is that a habitat type that is underrepresented? We want to make sure, secondly, that we've got at least 2 sites for each habitat type in each of those 7 different ecoregions. So we want to make sure that we've got some redundancy. And we want to set minimum acreage thresholds. We can't just have 1 or 2 acres of a spruce fir forest in conserved land and consider that to be kind of a viable, thriving, conserved unit. So we've got these thresholds. We sat down with our committee, folks like Josh at the Nature Conservancy, and then used some interesting new data layers that allow us to do this type of analysis. I didn't know that the Tunk Lake area was going to be such a popular focus today, but here we are again. So Tunk Lake at the bottom, Spring River Lake, the Donnell Pond, basically that area is in the lower left of this map. But we've got this new information or data layer, GIS layer on ecological systems, and so we can literally identify where each of these several dozen habitat types occur on the landscape. This is a new layer that's available now from Maine through Virginia. We've got it, the Nature Conservancy has it, and we're promoting and encouraging wider use of this kind of GIS information. So once we have this layer, it's not too much of a step to then overlay that with conserved lands. We can look at different types of conserved lands, whether they're easements or reserves, and we can identify whether the northern hardwood forest or the hemlock forest is within those conserved lands, how much we can quantify that, how much is in those conserved lands, or the cedar swamp, in this case, has very little of the conserved lands, and most of the cedar swamp is outside. So it's a very scalable technique. We can do this across landscapes of millions of acres. We can do this for individual land trusts. We've recently been working with the Kennebec Land Trust to identify individual parcels and within their land trust region of I think 18 or 20 towns, what are they missing in terms of habitat types? So what have we learned from this representational analysis? Well, the good news is we can all pat ourselves on the back because we've been doing a bang-up job at conserving wetlands. Great job. Okay, so wetlands, as it turns out, from a statewide perspective, are twice as abundant in conserved lands as they are in the landscape overall. No great surprise there. Wetlands are very cheap, and they have high biodiversity value. They're a good conservation target. So we've done a great job at conserving wetlands, both statewide and within the region. In the Down East region, wetlands are about as abundant within conserved lands, roughly 15% as they are on the landscape as a whole. So done a great job at conserving wetlands. And the good news is in terms of the specific habitat types that occur within each of the Down East regions that I looked at least one of each of the habitat types has been conserved at least once somewhere in that region. So the good news is if we take sort of just a strict sort of Noah's Ark approach and say we want to have at least one of each thing, we've done that. So we can check that off. But there are a number of habitat types where we have not met those minimum thresholds for either acreage or redundancy, number of occurrences, or broader representation. So there is a long list of those that I've generated. I don't want to go through each and every one of those because really what I want to convey here is the utility of the tool and the importance of using this tool as much as the results. But I do want to talk about a couple things that were I found a little bit interesting and surprising. In the Down East coastal region of Maine, we can see the conserved lands in two different types. Northern hardwood forest is underrepresented. I mean, certainly there's not a lot of northern hardwood forest in this region to begin with. It's dominated by spruce fir. If we go to the western mountains of Maine, northern hardwood forest is much more common. It accounts for about 5%, roughly 5% of this region, the landscape as a whole. Only 1.5% or so of conserved lands are northern hardwood forests. So part of that is where it tends to occur, is it's at the northern end of this region, particularly the northwestern end of the region. But it's considered underrepresented based on our analysis, and it does provide habitat for things like black-throated blue warblers and other things that don't occur as much in our lowland spruce fir. Moving north, what was missing from this region were primarily things from that reserved land category. And again, that's because only 1.2% of the overall region is considered reserved land. So lots of working forest conservation easements, very little land has been set aside from timber harvest, and our analysis showed that lowland spruce fir, spruce flats, and northern hardwoods were all underrepresented on that subset of reserved lands. They're well represented on the broader set of conserved lands, working forest easements, managed public lands, etc., but underrepresented on those reserved lands. So switching gears, this is, I think, a good example now just to talk about how this type of information or how these data layers can be used at scaling down to an individual land trust work. We're working with the Kennebec Land Trust here, and we can identify that a landowner came to them and offered them this piece of property. We could tell from our various data layers, as well as obviously walking on the property, the old-fashioned way, that it had northern hardwood forest, which was underrepresented within their conservation portfolio. So that helps them figure out not only a land that will be contiguous to their existing lands, but a land that from a regional or statewide biodiversity perspective can help fill a gap. So it's really a scalable conservation tool. Okay, I'd want to just spend a brief minute or two to talk about forests. Again, that's my background, that's my interest is forestry and forest ecology. And when we look at the forest age in Down East Maine, or the condition of our overall forests, this is from Maine Forest Service and U.S. Forest Service statistics. Only 3% of the forest is over 120 years old. Fully 90% of the forest is between 20 and 100. So there's not a lot of old forest left in the region. That's pretty clear. At the same time, I should also state that there's not a lot of young forest left. Early successional forest, the stuff from 0 to 20 years, only accounts for 3.4%. But the key difference is we know how to create that. We can create that stuff pretty easily. You can't just create old forest overnight. It takes, a century or a century and a half to grow. So as I do work, my conservation work with land trusts and others, I try to increase the awareness about the rarity and importance of these types. They are rare, increasingly rare from Nova Scotia to Ontario all the way down the East Coast. And they do have high biological value. The Manomet Center in Maine is a group that's done a lot of work on these and has identified that the loss of these older forest age classes is a major threat to forest biodiversity. They're taking some of their cues from Scandinavia. In Finland, for example, where they've got forests that have been fairly intensively managed for 100 years or more, less than 0.5% of the forest is old growth, and they've now got close to 1,000 species that they consider are vulnerable to extinction. A lot of these are not your spotted owls or glamorous, charismatic vertebrates. They're things like lichens and beetles, but nonetheless they have just as valuable kind of DNA as the mammals do and the birds. So it's a feature that's not captured necessarily in the habitat type maps, but it's one that I want to make sure that folks are aware of. Okay, so just to wrap up here with some take-home messages, in struggling with this question, our Ecological Reserves Committee of how much is enough, we've decided that it's not just that absolute number. It's not just the 70% that Woodlands and Wildwood is shooting for. It's what has been conserved. It's a finer scale look at, are we successfully achieving biodiversity conservation? Secondly, GIS and new statewide data sources are incredibly useful to inform our priorities and actions. And this is one thing I want to see if we have time for, is just discussion of whether there's access to this information, what we can do as state agencies or the Nature Conservancy or Maine Coast Heritage Trust to promote greater use and availability of this stuff. Thirdly, land protection efforts have been very effective for tidal marshes, wetlands, mountaintops, and some common forest types. Not surprisingly, the stuff that doesn't have a lot of operable timber on it, this stuff that's cheap. But there are some upland forest types that remain poorly represented on conserved lands, particularly within that subset of reserved lands. So those are my take-home messages. I did, just in terms of thinking about generating some discussion around this topic. You may have your own questions, and I'm happy to entertain those. But these are some of the questions that occurred to me in thinking about this topic. Again, as I just mentioned, the conservation practitioners have access to the most updated ecological information. And even if you have access to it, do you have the person on staff or the consultant who can go in with GIS and do some of the types of analysis that I'm talking about or that Josh is going to talk about this afternoon? What are some of the limitations to getting there? Secondly, should greater weight be given to tidal marshes and adjacent lowlands in light of sea level rise? We're doing a lot of work in Maine now looking at sea level rise and projections of what that may mean 100 years from now, projections of anywhere from 2 feet to 2 meters. The down east coast is a little different than Penobscot Bay and west in that a lot of our tidal marshes here abut right up against kind of a hard edge topographically, but nonetheless there are places like the Pleasant River marshes where there are lowlands adjacent to the rising seas. And then lastly, how do you weigh ecological factors with the whole gamut of social, political, economic, and others? I think my role here is just to get you to think about the ecological influences and factors and the data. But I recognize that everyone here who's working on conservation looks at those in light and in the context of all the other considerations you've got. So I think I'm probably doing okay on time. Yeah, we've got, all right, 30 seconds, sweet. So I'll leave those there. Feel free to take a shot at one of those, or if you have questions about any of the more technical stuff I've given you.
One of the things that I forgot to mention was about today's format. And if you haven't figured this out already, we've shifted the focus of the day a little bit. So we had started out with Jim giving us this big picture, okay, a context, some history. Then we moved to Bill, who was encouraging us to partner. Then we heard from the local land trusts, who told us they were partnering. And this part of the day, for the next 3 talks, we're actually going to focus on, okay, so how do we do a better job? We know that we're here to talk about how to work more strategically together, okay? But the question is, how do we do that? And so one of the things I forgot to mention was that Andy's talk and Josh's talk and then later Mark's talk is going to talk about tools that we can use to do a better job. So I'm sorry that I didn't mention that, but I know you're also smart that you already figured it out. So, Chris.
So I'm Chris Peterson. I'm at the College of the Atlantic, and one of the groups I work with is Frenchman Bay Partners, which is a collaboration of a lot of groups and towns. And of all the things we produced in our first 2 years, probably the one we get the most positive feedback from is a thing called Frenchman Bay Atlas, where we just tried to gather all of the GIS layers we could. And we produced a physical atlas, but then we also produced a very funky beta webpage where you could go online, pick the layers you want, and put them in. And one of the striking things for us as we've done this work is how disparate, how just the layers are everywhere. And there's no real good clearinghouse for them. There's no good one-stop shopping you can do to find all these layers. And so there's an abundance of information out there. And the state doesn't really put up private layers. And so there's the state, it's not really for the state to do. I think there's a room for some real clearinghouses of this kind of GIS information, because the towns just love that we've been doing this, and it's been working out really well for us. So that's just kind of my comment to your first question.
Well, it's an excellent point, and I've actually been to a couple different sessions where the same issue or question has come up with regional conservation partnerships. There's a variety of, I think, levels of sophistication in terms of GIS, but there are increasingly organizations, small organizations, that now have access to GIS, and kids coming out of college who can do more than we could ever do. And so I think that it's a useful thing for websites of organizations. If there's a Darren website where you could have a page that just lists access to some of the useful GIS layers. And there's a proliferation of them now. I mean, the state has some, but many of them are generated by the Nature Conservancy, NatureServe. It's just in talking to Whit from MCHD, it sounds like they are working with someone right now to do that very thing, to pull together all the various GIS layers that can be used for these types of conservation analyses. So it's a thing that's only going to become more important as time goes on. Good point.
I'm over here.
Sure.
So I'm Tora Johnson. I'm the GIS director at University of Maine-Machias. And I have one project where we're doing sort of just exactly that, is the Grow Washington Heuristic project, which is funded by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And the main thrust of, or one of the main thrusts of that project is to gather those kinds of layers across a whole broad spectrum and put them in digestible and usable and accessible and free, which is really key, online maps. And one of the threads of that is actually in the poster session, so come and see me there. The question I have for you though is, where do I get that layer?
Right now, we've got it, and the Nature Conservancy has it, and it's posted on I believe it's a TNC website, but it's not the most intuitive or obvious place to go. So it's not posted on a state website because it's a regional, from Maine to Virginia. I'll catch up with you afterward and send me an email, and we can, I can tell you exactly where to find it. Or
So, I'm here, Jim Levitt. My question is, the topic of the talk was how much is enough?
Mm-hmm.
And then you said 2.
Mm-hmm.
2 representative samples
Mm-hmm.
apparently is enough. What's the scientific basis for 2? For example, if you have the Penobscot River,
Yep.
are 2 spawning sites, is that enough for salmon?
Yeah, I should have clarified that was specifically with regard to this data layer of these ecological systems. So if you're familiar with this data layer, it's divided the terrestrial habitat up into about 50 different types for the entire state of Maine. It doesn't do a great job at aquatic systems. It doesn't do marine systems. So this is a terrestrial exercise, but it's still a valid question. And is 2 the right number? I don't know. I mean, should it be 10? Should it be 1?
I guess what I want to say is redundancy is great.
Yeah.
I congratulate you for wanting to have redundancy.
Yeah.
But, 2 it might be 14 for a particular species, or it might be 2,000. I don't know.
Right, right.
So just because your advisory board said 2,
Yeah.
there's necessarily no science.
Right, right. And of course, the neat thing about, I'll go to you in a second, Josh, the neat thing about GIS these days is you can go in and set that number to 5 and see what happens, see what then becomes underrepresented. And to take this one step further, and this gets a little more academic, I mean, you could come up with kind of the theoretical map or an optimization, knowing where all those habitats are, knowing how much acreage you need, knowing how many of them you need to conserve. You could come up with a theoretical map of what that solution would look like. And that gets a little, sort of big brother and black helicopters, so we haven't done that, but it's the type of thing that can be done. I want to go to Josh. I don't know if you were going to respond to that.
It was just a follow-up. And one of the dangers of setting limits and thresholds is that people see that limited threshold as the starting place, the top end rather than the bottom end maybe. And like the speed limit is really what you're supposed to go up to. So if my wife yells at me for only going 65, I'm trying to stay under the limit, not above the limit. But this 2 per subsection is rural, so it's not 2 per state by any means. And it also is the minimum threshold, so at least 2 protected per area is where we'd like to start. And there's a lot of political realities rather than just ecological that force that at least 2 limit. But you're absolutely right. We should be looking more, and these should be within functioning systems, not as isolated standalones.
As a biologist, I do want to state also that this is where the science does come in. So if you know that you have a particular species in your area, you really should do your homework and find out, well, what is the acreage or how many spawning sites, okay, is necessary for the success of that species, okay? So it ends up not just being a parcel of land, it ends up being how much, whatever, deer wintering area acreage is needed, okay? So, I would just encourage everyone to do their homework and figure that out. So Bill has a question, and this might be the last question.
Well, I'm going to slip in a comment, then a question. Comment on the how do you. I want to focus on the you. Just mention that in the late 1990s, a study out of Harvard Forest from Foster Gallaudet's did a similar study with similar results, meaning they compared conservation values in the region to what was protected. The result was that they suggested greater coordination of all the various partners would result in a greater representation of the landscapes within those conserved lands. That led to the formation of the North Quabbin Regional Landscape Partnership. My question is, how do you balance the focus on what's existing in terms of existing ecotypes, then say the forest types, northern hardwoods, for example, with the effort to look at the stage? I'm very curious about that because right now I feel like I'm swimming in the TNC resiliency science data and trying to wrap my mind around looking at the geology and the topography and the diversity and connectedness such that I'm, in a sense, setting aside what's on there now and looking at what could be there 100 years from now and focusing on the most resilient landscapes, whether it's northern hardwoods today or something else in the future. So could you speak to that, please?
I can speak to that. I don't have the answer, but I can tell you that we're thinking about it. I mean, the resilience layer referred to is something that the Nature Conservancy has produced over the last couple of years out of Mark Anderson's shop. The Open Space Institute is now using that to guide conservation. And it's getting a fair amount of traction, and I think the content of it is that 200 years from now, that northern hardwood forest may not be a northern hardwood forest anymore, but that south-facing slope on sedimentary geology at 1,000 feet is going to produce. I mean, that it's more important to save that part of the stage, to save that feature, than it is to save what's on it now. So we've been in discussion with the Nature Conservancy of how to blend this ecological system layer, which is what does the state look like now, with the resilience layer, which is how could this change over time, and then come up with a solution that involves both of those things. But we don't have the answer yet. We're thinking about it.
Okay, with that said, thank you, Andy. It's time for lunch.
Thank you.